Welcome everyone to the first CIAF seminar for 2026. Don't know how we got here so quickly. Of course, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land, seas and skies where we're all zooming in from today. And in my case, that's the Irukandji people who are the traditional owners of the JCU Nomumbada campus in Cairns, where we're bracing perhaps for a cyclone to come late tonight or tomorrow morning. I think it's going to get very wet up here very soon. Just for those of you who don't know, the CIAF seminars run on the first Thursday of the month through to November. So Therese has done a fantastic job putting the lineup together, and you'll see a link in the chat to the program if you haven't looked at the upcoming speakers. The Zoom link we're on today is the same Zoom link for every seminar this year. If you want to bookmark that, that link. These sessions are recorded for people who can't make the live session. The seminar will go for about 40 minutes and there'll be lots of time for questions at the end of the presentation. It's my great pleasure today to introduce our first speaker, and thank you, Annie, for agreeing to be the first speaker. Annie's an Associate Professor of Archaeology who's a CIAF Associate Investigator and an Adjunct Associate Professor at both the University of Queensland and James Cook University. Annie has also been working as part of CIAF's policy and translation team, particularly in the development of the project implementation guide and workbook, where she's been working closely with Vincent Backhouse, Matt Harris, and I, and many others on those great resources for the centre that continue to evolve. For those of you who don't know Annie, and I suspect there may be some in the room, I don't think there's much Annie hasn't done. She's been a consultant, she's been a public servant in New South Wales and in Queensland, and an academic for the last 30 years, I'm going to say. I've actually known Annie for more than 30 years. In fact, just over 30 years ago, Annie co-supervised my honours thesis. And since then, we've worked on many projects with community all over the place, including Waka Waka people who own the cultural place of Gummingurru that Annie will refer to today. In December last year, Annie was awarded the Rhys Jones Medal for outstanding contribution to Australian archaeology by the Australian Archaeological Association for her tireless efforts to centre traditional owners and Indigenous voice in heritage practice. And Annie, I can't think of a more worthy recipient of that award, recognising your many decades of service.
Thanks, John.
So, Annie, I'm really looking forward to your presentation today. Stones that speak, country that writes, legacy data that require permissions, ethics and challenging ontologies in co-design research and publication, a Gummingurru story. Over to you, Annie.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the country of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'd also like to acknowledge that my research work is with the people of the Danjaba and Glumpo people of Quandamooka and the Djarawar Waka Waka people from the Darling Downs. And it's the Darling Downs area that I'm speaking to you about today. And I'd like to pay my respects to all of their elders, past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that there are many First Nations people at this seminar today, and thank you very much for coming along. So this seminar is about ethics, free, prior and informed consent, care and fair principles and ethics, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights, Indigenous data sovereignty, and particularly these issues as they relate to project co-design and publication. For people who are not policy nerds, like Sean and Matt Harris and me, this all probably sounds incredibly boring. Important, but boring. So I decided that I'd use a case study to ground what I'm talking to you about. And so I'll begin by introducing you to the case study area, the Bunya Mountains and the Gummingurru Stone Arrangement site. The Gummingurru and Bunya Mountains cultural landscapes have for generations provided the backdrop for Aboriginal peoples across vast stretches of southern Queensland and northern New South Wales to come together for ceremony and to renew cultural and social ties. The archaeological evidence for these ceremonial activities is well known and is quite widely published. The Gummingurru stone arrangement site, which is here just north of Toowoomba, was a major node in the ceremonial journeyscape of travellers coming all the way from the coast across to Gummingurru on their way up to the Bunya Mountains. There were other cultural nodes as well, like Maidenwell and Challawong. So people would come every 3 years or so when the bunya trees had an abundant crop of nuts, and people would travel to the bunyas to participate in a whole range of festivities, including ceremony, trade, finding wives, making alliances and renewing alliances, and so forth. According to Bunya law, so that's the LORE law of all the different peoples who travelled to the bunyas, the rainbow serpent, Dakan, is a foundational ancestral being associated with the Bunya Mountains. And here you can see Dakan in a large stone sculpture at the Bunya Mountains. Like many other rainbow serpents across Australia, Dakan is intrinsically linked to water. Dakan journeyed via riparian zones and established song lines across country. And he now rests, or she rests, not quite sure whether Dakan was male or female, at a sacred waterhole, such as this one here in the Bunya Mountains. So these maps show the journey routes of Dakan from the Bunya Mountains and also back into the Bunya Mountains, following a number of different storylines radiating out from the Bunya Mountains. In many ways, the rainbow serpent's journeys act as a metaphor for the journeys of all the people who were travelling to and from the Bunya Mountains every 3 years. For many people, as I said before, this journey was via the Gummingurru site. So archaeologists and traditional custodians have been working together at Gummingurru to document the site and its cultural landscape for more than 25 years. Ours is a collaborative relationship, and we share stories from our often very different ontological perspectives. One of the most important motifs at Gummingurru is the rainbow serpent. It's the central feature of the Gummingurru site. When boys came to Gummingurru to be initiated into adulthood, they would first come to the belly of the carpet snake, which you can see here, and from there they'd be taken to the initiation ring to undertake their man-making ceremony. At the completion of their initiation journey, each initiand was assigned a yuri, or a totem. Now, the yuris are the motifs that we see in many of the stone arrangements at Gummingurru. They include an emu, which is this feature here, a catfish, there's the fish and there's its whiskers, there's the carpet snake, which is also known as the rainbow serpent. There's also a bunya nut, a large starburst feature, and the turtle itself. The stones that make up the motifs on Gummingurru were not selected randomly. They weren't a random grab of whatever stone came to hand. El Piotto has demonstrated that there are strong and statistically significant variations in the stones chosen for specific stone arrangements. For example, there are long, thin rocks that are used for the whiskers of the catfish. The initiation ring is comprised of entirely regular, almost cubic-shaped, small rocks. The starbursts have very large rocks in their centre and then small rocks in the radiating arms out of the starburst. And the head of the turtle, well, the head of the turtle looks like the head of a turtle. So the rocks were not randomly selected. And in fact, the rocks had genuine agency in and of themselves in ensuring that they would be properly selected. In a paper, the Gummingurru team and I wrote in 2022 for an international symposium on powerful stones. We argued that the Gummingurru stones and the motifs they form once had a complex relationship with their human relatives. These rocks created men, determined kinship relationships, dictated marriage alliances, maintained trade partnerships, established educational opportunities, directed land management activities, and most importantly, shared knowledge and social encounters. In the present, there is a new relationship between the stones and their human kin, including the raising of the stones from the ground that has covered them over. And this has led to a new form of powerful agency for the stones in terms of reconnecting people to place, building reconciliation, sharing past associations and future aspirations, and establishing conservation activities, both locally and regionally. In the paper we wrote, we argued that the relationship between the stones and the humans was and is more than a unidirectional entanglement of people moving stones. We argued that the stones held and continue to hold intrinsic power and agency, even sentience, over humans and the landscape, speaking to traditional owners, often through the agency of yuris, and in particular the willy wagtail. But how can stones, utterly inanimate objects, have their own sentience and agency independent of human beings? This was the exact question a reviewer asked of us when we submitted our paper for publication in the journal Archaeology and Oceania. Now, today is not the place to go into the arguments we made about agency and sentience. The issue here is how this epistemic position, taken by traditional owners who interpreted the site to us, was accepted by the publishers of an academic journal. We had two very different responses to our paper. The first reviewer got it. This reviewer said, "This is a fascinating paper which significantly advances our understandings of the archaeology of agency. The innovation of this paper derives from being embedded in an Indigenous ontological understanding of the world." The second reviewer didn't get it. I found the argument presented here for agency and the stones themselves fundamentally at odds with my own beliefs. I am not convinced by the argument as framed here, which I feel is an overreach. I do need to feel that there is a legitimate case to be made here. Unfortunately, the editor agreed with the second reviewer. I have problems with ascribing sentience to stone, since this implies to me that stone should be able to communicate with any human, and this I doubt. I suggest that the authors reconsider the use of this concept. There are important ethical considerations here, and these ethical considerations affected the way we responded to the reviewer's comments and the editor's direction that we should change the paper. But let's go through these ethical considerations. The first is free, prior, and informed consent. The archaeologists who are the lead writers of this paper had been given an immense privilege. Traditional owners had told us about their knowledge of how the stones at Gummingurru inform practice, LORE law, and LAW law. We had been charged with sharing this information to the archaeological world because the traditional owners were very proud of the powerful nature of the stones, and they believed that archaeologists would be interested in this thinking. To fail the TOs at this juncture would be to belittle their entire ontology and to go against their free, prior, and informed consent, which was to publish this way of thinking. The second principle is the care principle: collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. The narrative of the sentience and agency of the stones gave a collective benefit to the traditional owners, as this knowledge united them in their expression of significance of the stone. It provides their authority over the story of the stones, for which they have responsibility. To deny the sharing of this story, which TOs were requesting be shared, would be to relegate their knowledge to a second-class status of no apparent value to the Western-trained archaeology world. And this is clearly unethical. The third issue is the fair principle. The TOs wish to have this interpretation of the stones made accessible to their white archaeology colleagues, in the hope that sharing this story might encourage other TO groups who have challenging ontologies to share their perspectives on sentient and agentive objects. They were very proud of this narrative. Once again, to deny publication of this knowledge simply because it challenged the belief system of some archaeologists would be a slap in the face for the TOs. And then finally, Indigenous data sovereignty. The data upon which the interpretation of the stones is based are data that are under the sovereign authority of the traditional owners. As I've said, to challenge their narrative would be to challenge their sovereignty over the basic tenets of their LORE law and their LAW law. So we approached the revisions to the paper as a challenge. We doubled down. First, we searched additional literature on the notion of object agency, and we found a huge number of references that recognised other than human beings as having agency and even sentience. Next, we found lots of other examples of other than human beings that have agency and sentience. And these are just a few of the examples that we found. The upshot of our revised paper was that we had the paper published. And I must say, if it's not thought to be too much blowing my own trumpet, this is the best paper I have ever been involved in writing. It is a really great paper. And if you haven't read it, I think you should. Anyway, buoyed by our success with the paper for AO, we decided that we would take the ontological challenge one step further. For the WAC conference in Darwin last year, the Gummingurru team was invited by Brenda Bowser from Cal State to present a paper in her session on the ethnoarchaeology of landscapes and mobilities. And for this paper, we decided that we'd include country as an author of the paper. There were some problems getting the WAC website to accept country as author, but we did eventually succeed, and we were able to have country as author. And so we presented the paper at WAC, and then we presented an extension of that paper at AAA. And again, although there were some problems with the AAA website, we did eventually manage to have country as a listed author on the paper. In December last year, Brenda Bowser invited us to submit our paper to a special issue in the journal Archaeologies, the journal of WAC, in a special issue on the ethnoarchaeology of landscapes and mobilities. So on the 31st of January, we uploaded our paper to the Archaeology's publication website managed by Springer. The first problem I struck was that I was asked for each author to provide a title, an address, and an email address. I couldn't have Bunya Mountains and Gummingurru country as not other than human authors. So I called Bunya Mountains Mr. Bunya Mountains, said that he lived at Bunya Mountains National Park, and gave him the email address of bunya@bpac.org.au. And Mr. Gummingurru country, who lived at Gary Junction, was given the email address gummingurru@yahoo.com. I also found that the journal website wouldn't accept a corresponding author as last author. The corresponding author was automatically made lead author. As soon as I uploaded the paper, I received an email from Springer editorial manager requesting that I ensure that the order of authors on the paper conformed with the order of authors on the website. I wrote back and pointed out that the order on the paper was correct, that as corresponding author, I was last author, and that our lead authors were country. I then almost immediately got an email back from the journal's managing publisher. Thanks for sharing your cover letter. That does help explain things. I wasn't sure if you were referring to someone with the last name Country when they weren't in the email chain. Unfortunately, we just don't have the capacity to list Bunya Mountains and Gummingurru country as authors, though it's a lovely idea. Frankly, we found this quite insulting. And then to suggest that we could just pop country into the acknowledgements was completely and utterly patronising. Before I could respond to this email, Brenda Bowser, as guest editor, wrote the following email, which I think is brilliant. She first of all argued that practically Springer is able to list other than human authors when it lists agencies such as AusAid as an author on a paper. She talked about editorial policy on authorship, and she pointed out that authors themselves should decide on authorship. She finally made the point that Archaeologies is a publication of the World Archaeological Congress, and that the ethical principles of WAC recognise Indigenous intellectual property rights and rights of self-determination, and argued that intellectual property rights are inherent in country. I also sent in further details with respect to author biography. I made it very clear that this paper is authored by the country that has informed the research upon which the paper is based. I also argued that Bunya Mountains and Gummingurru country are the country of Jarowa clan, and as lead authors, country has led the research through providing direction and understanding of LORE law and LAW law. And as a consequence, I argued that we should be able to leave our authorship as requested. I also pointed out that there are many examples of country as authors on other papers, including even in a Springer publication. We even had support from the new president-elect of WAC, Dr. Jordan Ralph, who pointed out that assigning authorship to a non-human author means everything to the editors and authors, and including Bunya Mountains and Gummingurru country is important. I find this policy position by Springer strange and quite outdated. Further correspondence from Springer. I'm very sorry, but after discussing this matter with my manager, I've confirmed that there is no way we can accommodate your request to list Bunya Mountains and Gummingurru country as authors on the paper. Geographical features don't have the ability to consent to publication and to take authority for the content of the paper. An attribution of authorship carries with it accountability for the work. We do not allow LMMs to be credited as authors for the same reason. And this is despite the fact that I pointed out that there are actually 4 human authors on the paper, all of whom would be willing to take accountability for the content of the paper. So once again, we clearly have some ethical principles at stake here. First of all, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. Traditional owners strongly believe that country is a key author of the content of our paper. To deny authorship to such a powerful being is to deny the value, existence even, of that being, and this contravenes our Indigenous intellectual property rights. Closely related to ICIP is Indigenous data sovereignty, which means that Indigenous owners of intellectual property have a right to control and manage the data generated from the Indigenous knowledge. Those data, in the case of this publication, relate to stories of a very powerful creator being, the rainbow serpent Dakam. It would be utterly inappropriate to have Indigenous law and LAW law relegated to an acknowledgement just to meet a Western publishing construct. And finally, there are serious ethical standards that have been challenged by the publisher's stance in this instance. In response to Springer's emails, Brenda Bowser said that she was going to withdraw the entire issue from Archaeologies and find another publication. This is the email that we got 2 days ago from Springer. In a productive meeting this morning with several department heads, we tackled the question of how to list country and mountains as authors. All the higher-ups demonstrated an awareness of and commitment to the rising importance of this question of non-human authorship, especially with regard to Indigenous topics and writing. We think we have come up with some potential pathways to move us in that direction, but there are challenges for our production system. We need to ensure that it will actually work, and we need to figure out what the cost will be. So, a step in the right direction, yeah, but there is a cost involved. There are challenges that look like taking weeks to overcome. Partnerships with indexes can't be accommodated. Really? But at least people are beginning to think through this topic. We're not quite sure how this is going to end up and whether or not our paper will end up published in the journal Archaeologies or in a different journal. I want to finish off by looking at another related issue, and that's the issue of what to do with legacy data. This is not so much an issue associated with Gummingurru, but it is something that I've tackled quite recently as an editor of a couple of journals. So first of all, what are legacy data? Legacy data are data collected in the past, usually by someone other than a current researcher, though not always, and it's nearly always data that are published in the past. Although quite often legacy data relating to Indigenous people, sites, landscapes, etc., were collected with the approval of knowledge holders from the days in which the data were actually collected, this is not always the case, as we'll see in a moment. Even in circumstances where permissions to collect data were received at the time of data collection, permissions given in the past may no longer be appropriate in the present. So what happens when researchers want to reuse legacy data for new projects when the researchers don't have the express free, prior and informed consent from current owners of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property? So 3 quick case studies. First of all, at the 2019 AAA conference on the Gold Coast, a very senior and elderly archaeologist, even older than me, wanted to show photographs of rock art they'd taken in the 1960s and 70s. They'd been given approval by senior lawmen back then to photograph the art, and they'd been told stories about the art by these lawmen. They'd never shown these images before, nor shared the stories they'd been told in the 1960s, but felt that doing so at the 2019 AAA conference was appropriate. There were several members of that same Aboriginal community at the conference. When those community members got wind of what this archaeologist wanted to do, they were very upset. The art and the stories were very sensitive. They were gender and age restricted, and definitely not for sharing at a public forum, particularly when there were young members of the community present at the conference who could not see these images. The archaeologists concerned simply didn't understand the problem. They kept saying, "But I was given approval to take the photographs, and I was told these stories." They simply didn't get the fact that approval given in the 1960s did not amount to approval to show these images in the 2020s. A second case study. Recently, I edited a paper that had taken raw data excavated from a rock shelter site during the 1960s and then used new methods and techniques to reanalyze the data. This was zooarchaeological data, and the new techniques meant that identification of faunal remains that had not been possible in the 1960s was now possible. With this new interpretation of faunal remains, the entire interpretation of the rock shelter site was completely changed. But there was nothing in the paper that signalled that there'd been approval for this work by the Indigenous community. What should we do? And the third case study comes from another paper I was recently involved in editing. In this case, a team of archaeologists working closely with a number of Aboriginal groups were reassessing and reanalysing a specific artefact type that occurred across a wide area. They had included data from one region that was a little outside their specific research area, but they were only using legacy data and were comparing those data with the data that they had collected. The legacy data they were using was published data of figures and tables, and published images of the artefacts, and published interpretations of the data. Before the paper even went to the revised decision, the journal received information from traditional owners from the outlier region, indicating that they did not want any information from their country to be included in the research being reported in the paper. The author team argued they were only using legacy data. They weren't doing their own research. They were simply reinterpreting old data. What should happen? So the first thing we need to think about is, what's the ethics of using legacy data? This is a very busy slide, but this is from the IATSIS Code of Ethics. And the IATSIS Code of Ethics makes it very clear that agreement to participate in or support research must be obtained prior to research being undertaken. Reanalysis of legacy data is not just summary of legacy data, it's new research. And IATSIS makes it clear, where research involves access to and use of data and information that was collected for administrative or previous research purposes, researchers must be aware of particular ethical issues that arise in relation to those Indigenous data. Consent should be obtained wherever possible. So if we go back over our 3 case studies. Case study 1, what should happen with information being presented at a conference, even when somebody says that they were originally given approval to collect those data? The first issue is ethics. Ethics principles have changed since the 1960s, 50 years ago, and they continue to change right up to today. Research that's undertaken today must be undertaken in keeping with ethical requirements of today. Principles of FPIC, ICIP, IDS in the 1960s were nothing like what is recognised today. And secondly, the data that were collected in the 1960s were not collected with the view to public showing. And the stories that were provided to the archaeologists were not provided with the view to being presented to a very large audience 50 years later. The outcome was that the paper was withdrawn from the conference. Case study 2, the reanalysis of faunal remains. The authors of this paper were contacted by the editors of the journal and asked to provide evidence that the Aboriginal community had indeed given permission for this work to be done. The authors immediately sent a copy of approval from the local Aboriginal Land Council, which indicated that the local Aboriginal Land Council had given permission to conduct the study, and furthermore had also given permission for the kind of analysis of bone that was being presented, and were in fact very keen for this information to be published and this reinterpretation of the site to be published. With this assurance and an acknowledgement put into the paper itself, that paper was published. With the third example, the reanalysis of the artefact type, the authors were contacted by the journal and advised that the traditional owners did not want legacy data used in this way. At first, the authors were a little concerned, arguing that they were simply using legacy data. But when it was pointed out to them that, first of all, the TOs had expressly said they did not want their data incorporated in the paper, and secondly, that they weren't just citing legacy data. They were actually taking legacy data and undertaking new research, new interpretation of those legacy data. They agreed and withdrew the legacy data from the paper. The paper has now been revised and is back with the authors to check that that revision is adequate. So what are the key issues that we're talking about here? Old approvals can't be assumed to carry into the present. Free, prior and informed consent needs to be given at all stages of the project, not just at the start. ICIP can change over time. Indigenous data sovereignty means sovereignty over the past, in and for the present. And ethics approval may need regular and constant updating. The outcome for CIAF is that co-design means collaboration throughout the life of the project, because approvals and sovereign management may change over time. So in short, ethics matters. Ethics has consequences in the real world. It's not just a nice idea to follow ethics principles. It's key to undertaking collaborative co-design research. So thank you for listening, and hopefully there'll be some time now for questions.